Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Madeline No, and I'm from NetHope, and we want to welcome you to part 3 of our AI Ethics webinar series. This series has been put together in collaboration with the organizations you see at the bottom of your screen: USAID, Plan International, MIT D-Lab, and NetHope. Before we get started with our session today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines. We'd like to keep this session interactive. Please post your questions and comments in the Zoom chat window for our Q&A discussion toward the end of the hour. After our session today, please look for a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording for this session, plus any links and collateral that were covered during the webinar. And after the session today, we really appreciate your input, so please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll that will be presented once you close out of the session. And with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague Layla Toplick to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Madeline, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of NetHope's AI Working Group and our partners, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the AI Ethics webinar series. And today I'm joined by two of our close collaborators on this topic of AI ethics, Amy Paul from the USAID Center for Digital Development and Amit Gandhi from the MIT D-Lab. Welcome, Amy and Amit. Now, let me provide some context before we dive into the topic we have planned for this webinar, as we have quite a diverse group here, and some of you might not have seen our first two webinars in this series. This webinar is part of a larger AI ethics effort that is led by NetHope's AI Working Group, and that is a group of global NGOs in close partnership with USAID and MIT D-Lab. And we're working together to build capacity in the nonprofit sector to design and use AI responsibly and ethically. And we've been doing that through a set of virtual sessions, including webinars like this one, and very soon virtual workshops, plus a portfolio of content and tools that will be available in the form of a toolkit later this year. And I want to call your attention to several upcoming sessions so you can save those dates on your calendars. As some of you might know, in the first 3 webinars in the AI Ethics webinar series, we're focusing on responsible innovation and how to design ethical AI solutions and programs. But in order to have ethical AI solutions, we also need the organizations that are developing and using those solutions to be ethical and responsible. So in part 4 of the webinar series, which will be scheduled for July 16th, same time as this webinar, we will explore how ethical considerations are integrated into organizational culture and processes, and how to design responsible organizations. And we'll be exploring this topic of designing responsible organizations first through a conversation with technology companies like Microsoft and IBM, as requested by many of you in the poll and the survey for the last 2 webinars. And then we're also planning to do more hands-on discussions in the fall. So that's the latest in the webinars. The second save the date that I'd like to share with you is that on August 5th, we'll take the concepts that you've been learning about in these first 3 webinars and bring them into a virtual workshop format. This is where you'll have the opportunity to explore the questions surrounding the principle of fairness in the context of real-world use cases from the humanitarian and international development sector, including education, health, agriculture, workforce, and humanitarian response. And given the limited number of spots available for these virtual workshops, 40 per workshop, we plan to offer this workshop 3 times between early August and the end of September. So keep an eye out on the invite. It's coming in early July, right before July 4th holiday. Next slide, please. Now, 2 weeks ago, we started with a brief introduction to AI and machine learning and provided examples of the use cases in our sector for the various AI capabilities. And then Amy helped us explore the risks in the context of values and ethical considerations that are particularly relevant for machine learning with respect to fairness. So if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend to review the recordings and slides from both June 4th and May 21st webinars. In fact, that is a requirement for participation in the virtual workshop. Next slide, please. And in June 4th discussion, I do want to flag that and highlight that you asked a number of really excellent questions, including several questions about data, which we'll want to come back to today. So questions around good data practices, including how to approach protected attributes, what do you do when you have limited amounts of data, and others. So expect a lot more about data as we go into today's topic. In fact, if we go to the next slide, today, what we'll do today is explore ethical considerations, specifically fairness, across all stages of a machine learning project, from data collection and processing to model creation, implementation, and maintenance. And we will do that in the context of a practical use case or a case study. So now it's my pleasure to invite Amy and Amit to take us through these topics, and we'll have some time for the Q&A at the end. So do post your questions in the chat window. Over to you, Amy.
Great. Thanks so much, Layla. Happy to be joining you all again. If you go ahead and go to the next slide, I'm really excited to be here today to kind of share work that we have done in partnership with MIT C-Lab, with Amit and his colleagues, that was released earlier this year. And it has a slightly different focus than some of the work that we've done at USAID before, where we had started with trying to contextualize considerations around data science and machine learning for development professionals who likely aren't data scientists by training, but has been evident throughout this series and many conversations that we've had with others that doing this work well really does require a lot of different stakeholders to be involved and have very important roles to play. And there's an especially important role for those who are actually developing machine learning models, and the influence that the choices that they make in building those models have on the fairness of their outcomes. So this resource really aims to contextualize some of the technical decisions that are encountered when applying machine learning in developing world context, focusing on those that are made in the development of a machine learning model. As we go through the example today, and as you'll find in this report, it really is trying to clarify some of the decisions and choices that data scientists make, and where there often is a default tendency to try to build the most accurate model possible, to really start integrating some of these considerations around fairness, transparency, some of the trade-offs between those and model accuracy, and recognize that there isn't really one universally right way to do this, right? That we are making choices all the time, and we have to think through and be very deliberate in the choices that we make, and recognize that the outcomes that they have will have real-world impacts on not just accuracy, but fairness as well. So today, Amit will provide some insight into these technical approaches, both in terms of decisions and what we can do to mitigate unintentional bias or unfair outcomes that might stem from choices made during the model building process. So if you go to the next slide, as Layla mentioned, we are kind of zeroing in on how these fairness considerations show up in the process of building a model. And you might ask, what is a machine learning model, right? There are lots of ways that you can kind of depict that, and it's not necessary that you go through every single one of the details here. But what we're doing is using this just as a general framework to give you a sense of where today's discussion will be, right? And thinking through different steps from reviewing the data and processing that data to making choices about model design, the algorithm choice, and accuracy metrics that you may use in developing a model, but then thinking through how you might integrate the results of that model into practice. So Amit will go through those in more detail, but just wanted to highlight that that's kind of the focus area for today's webinar. If you go to the next slide, throughout the case study today, you'll hear Amit refer to fairness considerations, and just a quick reminder that those are the ones that we talked about last time in terms of equity, representativeness, explainability, auditability, transparency, and suitability. So we will define those here today, but hopefully you'll see where those are coming up in the different examples that Amit will highlight in the case study. Okay, and next slide. So we're going to transition to, again, thinking about a practical context in which we are developing a machine learning model and these fairness considerations come into play. And if you go to the next one, what we're going to do is focus on a credit scoring application. So you remember that's one that we highlighted last time, to really look at where these fairness considerations show up in the process of developing a machine learning model, talk through some of the technical approaches that can mitigate the risks that we talked about of different ways that unfair outcomes can manifest. And then we'll also get at some of the questions that we can ask along the way to make those fairness considerations transparent and guide decisions about what's best in the context that we're working in. So I'll hand it over to Amit to walk through the case study and talk about the details more specifically, and we'll pick up at the end. Over to you, Amit.
Hi, thanks Amy for the introduction. Next slide, please. So as we talk about fairness considerations throughout the machine learning process, we really want to use this case study as a guide, and we want to be able to highlight areas where ethical issues could come up, like Amy said. This is a fictional case study about a solar lighting social enterprise that provides household level solar products, and what they want to do is they want to increase the impact that they're having. What they currently do is they loan assets in the form of solar panels and other devices to customers in a rent-to-own model. So customers are given loans to buy solar assets, and then they pay that back over a period of 1 to 3 years. They collect basic information and want to use this information to develop creditworthiness algorithms to help decide who they should give loans to for larger solar products. And they're also thinking about maybe providing this information to financial institutions so they can provide loans to their clients as well. Next slide, please. Now, as we get to the next part of this webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to provide an overview of how the different issues of fairness play a role throughout the different parts of the machine learning process that Amy introduced earlier. Next slide, please. So we like to break the machine learning process into 3 main phases. The review data phase, the build model phase, and the integrate into practice phase. And we're going to talk through each of these more in detail throughout the webinar, but before we can really talk about any of these phases individually, we really need to start with problem definition, which comes before going forward with this. Next slide, please. Now, every machine learning project should really start with the problem definition phase. This is where you're going to define your objectives, and you really want to engage all of the relevant stakeholders in this process. We're going to stress this idea a couple times, but there isn't really a formula you can follow that's just going to ensure that your model is unfair or is fair or unbiased. And what we really want to do is we really need to engage with the team, with sponsors, with content and context experts, users, analysts, and really figure out what issues may come up, and maybe even if machine learning is the right approach to address the problem that you're trying to do. And we really want to remember at this point that everyone's bringing their own biases and perceptions into this conversation, and it's okay to have disagreements. And as long as you work through them, you'll be able to ensure that you have better outcomes and ensure better fairness at the end. Next slide, please. And we also want to think about protected attributes during the problem definition phase. So these are traits that should not be used as a basis for decision-making in our machine learning process. Sometimes they're legally mandated in parts of the world, but oftentimes it's left to the organization and the analysts to define what these are and make sure that they get implemented in our models. So some commonly used protected attributes are race, age, gender, religion, and others. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that the model doesn't treat people differently if they're in different protected attribute groups. And this is both in terms of accuracy, but also the outcomes that, that different groups get at the end of the process. Next slide, please. So as we go through the webinar, like we said, we're going to be tying the topics that we just introduced back to the solar lighting social enterprise case study. And for the problem definition, what we want to do is we want to make sure that the organization is making sure that they're asking the right question. And the way you ask a question can lead to very different implementations. So for example, if we ask, who have we given loans to before? Our model could end up looking for individuals that are similar to past loan recipients. If we had any biases in our selection process before, these would get propagated in our model, which is generally a bad thing. Instead, if we looked at who is likely to repay our loans, we might end up with a model that looks at successful loan repayment as a metric instead. This should lead to a better outcome, but we still need to be careful about the biases and fairness along the way. Another question we may want to ask ourselves is, do we want to target off-grid areas preferentially compared to urban areas? And if this is part of the organizational mission that we want to do, then maybe this is a good thing to do. And if we're trying to be fair across the entire area, then maybe this is something that we really want to avoid. So it kind of depends on what our core values are as an organization. And then taking just a further step back, we really should consider if repayment of loans for solar products is a good overall proxy for credit worthiness. And if it is, then great. But if it's not, then maybe we either want to scale back the way we're thinking about this or not move forward with this. Next slide, please. So after you define a problem, it really makes sense to go forward to enter the review data phase of the machine learning process. And this is going to have two major components, which are data collection and data pre-processing. Next slide, please. So the data collection consists of aggregating data collected by the organization or external sources. And this could be a variety of types of data. So you could be collecting field data internally, you could be purchasing data sets, you could be collecting data sets from publicly available sources, or any combination of these or others. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that if we're thinking about this through a fairness lens, is that systematic biases can really be introduced through the data collection, and they're really hard to address downstream. So simple choices, just like choosing the type of data we're going to use, inherently introduces our own biases about what we think is important. So if we choose to look at whether someone is employed or not, that's we're inherently saying that we're biased towards thinking that people who are employed are going to be more likely to pay back loans. Additionally, the way in which data is collected also introduces its own biases. And we have to be particularly careful with external data because we don't really know how it's collected, and there might be biases or errors baked into it. So, so just making sure that we are extra careful when we use external data. Finally, we also really need to make sure at this point that we're collecting data on protected attributes. This sometimes seems counterintuitive, and the question that often comes up is, if we don't want to use this information, wouldn't we be better off not collecting it? Well, when you build your models, you can't really know if you're being fair or unbiased towards a specific group without collecting this information. And data that we're collecting may be heavily correlated with protected attributes, and we want to make sure we don't use that in our models. So in our case, gender may be correlated with age and marital status. Another example that we see in the US a lot is that zip code or distance to public transit is highly correlated with race. And if we don't collect data on protected attributes, we can't know if certain attributes that our model is using are correlated with those protected attributes and if we're actually being fair and not using that information. Next slide, please. So after we collect data, we have to move on to pre-processing the data. And this is going to involve two main components, which are the cleaning and labeling of data. So basically getting it in a form that our algorithms can use. So cleaning data is where we go through our data and we get rid of erroneous data and make sure that it's in the right format. And then labeling data, which is something that happens in supervised learning, is where we assign tags to the data. So we might say that this picture of a car is a car. For fairness considerations in this part, we're really worried about propagating biases in our data collection phase or introducing new biases. And in the real world, not all data is equal, and sometimes data for specific subgroups is much harder to collect or clean than others. So you may have handwritten records for one group and digital records for another. And as an organization, you have to decide if the two groups are similar enough where omitting the handwritten data will not add biases. This is not something that the analysts can do by themselves. So what you really should do is engage with conversations with experts who are familiar with the context, and they can weigh in on what they think. Also, it's important to note that data labelers can introduce their own biases. So people may have different perceptions of what cars look like or what houses look like. And if you're building a model that's going to use this, then those biases will make it into the model at the end. Next slide, please. Now let's move back to our case study and look at representativeness and how we can address it. So there's a question from a previous webinar that asked about some techniques for dealing with data that isn't representative. And I also want to stress at this point that real world data is never going to be completely representative in all the ways you want and balanced. And so what you're doing is you're basically playing a game of trade-offs and figuring out how you can best deal with it. So in our case, let's assume that data for loan repayments and our client information is primarily collected electronically in urban and peri-urban areas. And as we move to more rural areas, we're going to get more and more handwritten records. We also want to assume that electronic data is easy to process. And as we start transcription of written records, it's going to add more time and cost and error into the process. And finally, if we have data in other languages, translation is going to add another barrier in terms of cost and accuracy. So, so that gets even more expensive than just transcription. And what we want to do is look at how we should approach this in a way that's fair, or as fair as we can be, in a way that's at least looking at mitigating the biases that we'll come across in this process. Next slide, please. So how do we actually address some of these issues with representativeness? Well, the first thing we should do is we really should check to see if our data needs to be representative for these specific subgroups. So if we had two communities that were similar and one had electronic data and the other didn't, maybe our models would just be fine just using the electronic data. And if we engaged our field staff and experts on this conversation and they said that it was fine, then we would feel more comfortable going forward with that. However, in this case, it's more likely that we have a systematic problem where rural areas have handwritten data and urban areas have electronic data. And so we would be excluding rural areas in this case. And so we would probably want to address this in some other ways. Another way to check for whether or not we have representative data is to train different models where we vary the representativeness and we see how our accuracy is affected. Now, in our research group at MIT D-Lab, Rich Fletcher and Subi Olubeko conducted a study where they were building a model to predict if patients who came to a clinic in India had specific respiratory illnesses. And these were asthma, COPD, allergic rhinitis, or a few others. And the majority of the patients who came to the clinic were male. In health, you can't say, often you're dealing with people who are coming to a clinic and you have to just take the sample that you're given. So what they did was they constructed different training data sets that used a subsample of the male participants to get different ratios of men and women for their training data. So they generated training sets that ranged from 50% male, 50% female to 87.5% male and 12.5% female. And what they wanted to do was look at the prediction accuracy of these models for both men and women. What they found was that varying the representativeness for men and women didn't change the prediction accuracy for asthma and COPD. And this also kind of makes sense medically because asthma prevalence isn't a sex-linked illness. And so in this case, it would make sense that we could not collect representative data that's completely balanced for gender, and we could move forward with using this model as is. However, if we find that we need more representative data, the best solution is always going to be to collect it. But that's not always feasible because of the time or cost associated with that. And if that's the case, then we want to be looking at some other techniques that we can use to implement, to overcome the lack of representativeness in our data. So these techniques aren't as good as collecting more data, but they may be good enough for our needs. And I'm going to briefly introduce two approaches, the first of which is data augmentation. So data augmentation is where we're taking data that we already have for groups that we want more data for, and we're changing it slightly to generate more data. And to explain an example of this, let's look at a case study where we're identifying infections looking at pictures of wounds. If we don't have enough pictures from one subgroup, we could generate additional pictures from the ones we already have by doing things like cropping them, rotating them, reflecting them. And that's going to result in more overall pictures for that group. Because they're based off of pictures we already had, it's not going to be as good as having a new set of pictures, but it's going to add to the representativeness of our data set and hopefully give us better results than if we didn't do this at all. Another approach is to do bootstrap resampling or generation of synthetic data. And this is where we either resample randomly from our training set, so some data points are chosen more than others, and we use that to achieve a balanced data set, or we generate additional data that could be fictitious that's similar to the data we have already. In the solar lighting example, this may mean that we generate fictitious individuals who are similar to the ones in the group that we're missing representation from, and we'll use them as part of the training set as we build our models. And finally, if we find that none of these approaches are good enough for what we're trying to do and we're not able to overcome the lack of representation, and our models are going to be unfair, we have to go back and collect more data or limit the scope for which they can be used. In our case, we may say that our model is fine for determining loan, for looking at loans for urban areas, but maybe we should not use this model past that in more rural areas. Next slide, please. So let's move on to the next phase now, which is where we're looking at building a model. And this is going to consist of model creation, model tuning, and model evaluation. And what you'll often do is you'll create and tune multiple models and compare them at the end to see which one has the desired outcomes that you want. Next slide, please. So the model creation step involves selecting and developing specific models using our data. We start by choosing an algorithm, and we're splitting our data into a training set and a test set. The training set is going to be used to build our model, and the test set is going to be used as a way to compare model performance across our models. The fairness considerations at this point primarily involve understanding the strengths and limitations of our different models. So these should be clearly communicated between the analyst and the organization, just to make sure that we can make the appropriate choices and that we're making choices deliberately. For example, choosing a specific algorithm is a choice that's going to reflect the biases of an analyst because they work in different ways. Also, different algorithms can propagate biases in data in different ways as well. So we really want to make sure that these choices are made deliberately and engaging the full team and not just the analysts. They're not technical decisions by themselves, but they have broader implications. And there's often a trade-off between speed, accuracy, and explainability of models, and this needs to also be discussed and made as a choice. So let's move forward to the next slide. Let's look at an example of choosing an algorithm. And so one algorithm that we could use to determine if we want to give loans to somebody is the K nearest neighbors classifier. And in this classifier, K is a hyperparameter that determines how the algorithm works. So if K is 3, what we would do is we would look at the 3 people that are most similar or closest in a mathematical sense to our potential loan recipient and see if they were given loans or not. And then we're going to use the majority of what happened in the past to determine what happens to this new recipient. So this is a pretty easy algorithm to implement, and it's pretty straightforward, but it could propagate biases in our data without us knowing it. So if we were biased against a specific subgroup without knowing it, then our potential loan recipient who was part of that group would have a higher chance of not getting a loan. Further, we also have another problem of explainability. So we can't tell someone why they didn't receive a loan or what they could do to improve their chances of getting a loan in the future. So the choice to use this maybe wouldn't make the most sense considering what we're trying to do as an organization. Next slide, please. So after we build a model, what we need to do is we need to tune the model by setting thresholds and hyperparameters. So again, like the K and the K nearest neighbors classifier is a hyperparameter. And if we increase it to 5 instead of 3, we're looking at the 5 nearest individuals instead of 3. And this is going to change the way the underlying model itself works. And so we want to make sure that as we change these, that we're not having unintended consequences. The setting of threshold also introduces an important fairness consideration. And what we'll have to do often is make decisions between aggregate performance or performance for specific groups or individuals. Next slide, please. So let's say that we implemented a logistic regression model and we found that, that men and women have different default rates for loans. And we can interpret this to mean that men and women have different likelihoods of loan repayment. So what we need to do is we need to determine what we need to do in order to determine if somebody gets a loan using our model is to set a threshold value above which someone is given a loan and below which someone is refused a loan. So the graph on the right is what's called a receiver operating characteristic curve, or ROC curve. And it's going to plot sensitivity on the y-axis and 1 minus specificity on the x-axis. So that means that the y-axis is going to be our true positive rate, and the x-axis, which is 1 minus specificity, is our false positive rate. And if we choose the circle in the middle, which is the equalized error for both groups, then what we're doing is we're minimizing the overall error. But however, in doing so, we're going to increase the false positive rate for one group and increase the false and negative rate for another. That means that one group would have more qualified loan recipients being rejected, and the other group would have more unqualified loan recipients being given loans. So your error rates are similar, but your errors are in different directions. And what's important here is that the choice of how we implement this threshold really determines how the model performs, and it's not a technical decision. And so a lot of times what seems like a technical decision may have a large impact on who benefits from the model in practice and should not be left to the sole decision for the analyst. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to cover is how we can implement fairness in different ways. So we said that men and women have a different likelihood of loan repayment, but what does it mean to be fair when we're giving out loans? And there are many different ways to implement fairness, and we need to decide what works the best. And we can think of this as a conversation around how we want to implement equity. So say we had 1,000 potential solar lantern buyers, 500 of whom are men and 500 of whom are women. One way to implement fairness is through a process that's called fairness through unawareness. And this is where we basically say that we're not going to consider if someone is a man or a woman when giving them a loan. And this is relatively simple to implement, but usually not recommended because we often have other data that is correlated with our protected attributes, and our models will pick up on that and use that information. So in this case, formal employment may be highly correlated with gender, and if our model uses that information, then we could end up with a gender bias model even if we ignore gender as one of the criteria. The other three approaches listed in this table are going to be what are called fairness through awareness approaches. So demographic parity is where we say that we're going to implement a fairness criteria so that the percentage of men who receive a loan is the same as the percentage of women who receive a loan. And while this sounds fair initially, it could also be detrimental to the objectives you're trying to achieve. You could imagine a case where your algorithm would ideally give a loan to 40% of the men who applied and 60% of the women who applied because that's who would repay our loans. But using demographic parity, you may end up having to give a loan to only 40% of the women who applied, resulting in some women who should have received a loan and could have paid it back not being allowed to get one. And sometimes demographic parity is required by law as well. So you may be in the case where you have to use it, but there are other ways to implement fairness as well. So another approach is to say, let's implement equalized opportunity. And in equalized opportunity, what we're saying is that of the people who are going to pay back a loan, both men and women have the same rates of getting a loan. And so if we had 100 men and 200 women that would repay a loan and had limited resources, we would want to make sure that 50% of those 100 men and 50% of those 200 women got loans. Finally, we also have equalized odds, which is similar to equalized opportunity, but it's not just in the positive case. So we want to make sure that the percentage of men and women who don't get a loan when they will default should also be the same. So instead of being fair when we provide loans, we also want to be fair when we're rejecting people for loans. So these are different ways to implement fairness, and they all have different advantages and disadvantages, but an organization has to make a decision about what it should do and what it thinks its priorities are. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, the last phase of the process is going to be what we're going to call integrating it into practice. And this is going to involve deployment and maintenance of our models. Next slide, please. In this phase, machine learning algorithms are deployed in the field. And often we'll want to start with a small beta phase and scale it up if it's working well. And we'll also want to start integrating our model into real-world decision-making processes so the model is actually having a real-world impact. We want to make sure it's working well, and we don't have any unintended consequences at this point as we scale it up. And if there are any that come up, we want to be able to address them. We also want to make sure that we're clearly communicating how the model works to people who are using it. And this includes any shortcomings it has, because we don't want the model to be applied to a case that it shouldn't be applied to. And so we want to be clear about what the model is designed for and how it should be used, and be clear about the communication for everybody who's going to be engaging with it. Next slide, please. So deployment case study that we could talk about is, say we're trying to distribute a new product, which is a solar-powered television. And if the model determines that places with the highest rates of solar usage were good candidates for loans, we may find ourselves distributing solar televisions only in one part of the country. So this could unfairly impact individuals living in other areas, and maybe isn't the way that this model was originally intended to be used, because we were looking at if somebody would pay loans, not to decide where we're going to provide services. Next slide, please. And the last part of the model is going to be the maintenance phase. So after deployment, what we need to do is make sure that the model is being monitored as new data comes in, and that we're retraining the model if necessary. The main takeaway here is that as time goes on, the world is going to change, and the less accurate your model is going to get. Just because we implemented fairness in our model at the start, we can't be sure that our model will continue to be fair as we scale it. And so to do this, what we need to do is we need to regularly audit our models, as well as rectify any biases or unintended negative consequences that may arise from this. This is really important because your organization needs to be able to react to things when they're not going well and fix them, because if you've done harm through building your model, you need to be able to come up with mechanisms to be able to rectify those harms. Next slide, please. So an example of maintenance could be the imposition of a kerosene tax that would disproportionately affect the rural population of solar asset users. So while people are adjusting to this tax, they would have less disposable income, and the model may choose not to provide loans to them. And we would, in fact, really want to be doing the opposite. We would want to be paying attention to what's happening and provide loans to these individuals, because they would be able to benefit most from these loans. So paying attention to the context in which the model is being applied and adjusting accordingly is really important. And we need to be able to make sure that we have things in place to make sure that we can do that. So thanks for listening to this. And I'm going to now hand it back to Amy, who's going to highlight some of the key questions to ask along the process, as well as key takeaways.
Great, thanks so much, Amit. So before you get totally overwhelmed by the slide, I just want to say thanks so much for that walkthrough. You know, that was a lot of information and a lot of different things to process at once. And I think we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so that's great. But before we get there, I wanted to just take a moment to zoom out and look at this process again and highlight some of the questions, you know, that Amit has highlighted, that we've covered in the previous 2 webinars, so you can really see how these map to different considerations during the process of building a model, right? Even starting at the very beginning, from thinking about your problem definition and the conversations that we had with Nora and Hyatt around the plan example of how diverse is the team that's working on these, right? That's developing the problem. Do you have a group of people who are going to both understand the context and the machine learning needs of the problem that you want to solve, starting from the very beginning? Thinking through to reviewing data and asking those questions about what biases might be in my data, how representative are they for the context, what might I do to improve the representative of that data, does it include those protected attributes that I know if I simply leave out, I may still be at risk for introducing bias, right? And so whatever data you're working with, asking these questions can help you understand what biases might be present and whether or not you actually have data that's going to help you be able to mitigate those biases because you can check for it. Thinking through to the next building the model stage, right? Lots of questions and decisions that you make in terms of selecting the algorithm and model tuning. Amit talked about several ways those choices might actually change how the model functions in practice. And also thinking about, back to the last webinar, you know, how easy is it to explain what's happening given the algorithm that you choose? Can you actually understand which of those attributes is driving the prediction that you get? Thinking about how to best implement fairness and these trade-offs that Amit was talking about between model accuracy and equity is really important, and something that I think the MIT Exploring Fairness in Machine Learning report does a great job of walking through, knowing that, you know, just because you do these things, there isn't one way to do it that's always right. And you have to think through which trade-offs are going to be appropriate in your context, knowing that sometimes some are going to matter more than others, right? And his example too of looking through, you know, choosing that is going to introduce differences in false positives and false negatives. It might introduce differences in which populations, you know, receive an accurate prediction more often. All of those things are discussions that are going to be made richer and more appropriate for your context when you involve both technical machine learning experts and people who are really familiar with the context and problem. And then thinking into this integration into practice, you know, given all of those considerations around the equity of your model, the representativeness of the data, how well you can explain it, think about what you need to do with it in practice, right? Is this appropriate? Where is it appropriate? What are the limits of what I trust these predictions to offer? and then thinking through those issues over time, right? As Amit mentioned and came up in the questions beforehand, things change. The world is dynamic, and what processes do you have in place to be able to detect when your model actually may not be working as well as it did initially, to audit how it's working. These all go back to that concept of accountability and the ability to recognize when you may actually need to course correct. So all of these questions are, illustrative of things that we can do in terms of taking an active role in deciding how to shape, design, and use machine learning applications in development practice. Many of these you'll see in the AI suitability framework and also in the MIT report that was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. And I would encourage you really to look at both of them, given that they do complement each other quite well and focus on both the broad considerations of using it within your organization and this more narrow focus on specific decisions made in the process of developing machine learning models. So I hope that this walkthrough was helpful in showing that there are technical decisions and approaches that we can employ to check for bias in the process of developing machine learning models. That doing some of these can make these fairness considerations more transparent and help us understand the implications of the choices that we make. Again, the spirit of all of this is in leading to more productive collaborations and conversations with a diverse group of stakeholders to make these decisions more transparent and be very deliberate about how we're using these tools in practice. Well, I'll stop there and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Amit or Leila, anything else you want to add before we open it up for questions?
No, this was fantastic. I think quite a bit of information. Special thanks to you and Amit for putting all this together. As you've seen in our progression from the first webinar and brief introduction to AI ethics and a practical example, then the last webinar where we explored values and principles, and now in this webinar, we really went deep into a machine learning project. And I also realized that you might want to come back to some of this content, and we will, as Seth noted, have the recording and the slides posted for you. And do feel free to also follow up after the webinar if you have any questions. And thank you for your feedback that we're seeing in the chat window. So let's start with the questions that we have, and do feel free to post any questions, or also let us know if there are any specific other topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future as part of this webinar series. So I'll start with a note from Wayne, and Wayne, let us know if you have a follow-on question. I think Amit answered that, but I think your point is very important, as Amit also emphasized, where you noted that you worry that even if you don't include questions such as race, the algorithms are pretty good at finding proxies for race like zip code. And you're absolutely right. And as Amit noted, yes, there can be other data that could be correlated with protected attributes. So as you noted, zip code with race. So if you have a follow-up question, do let us know. Now, Alice, you asked a really important question, which is oftentimes the reality in the nonprofit sector. So in the collection phase, and correct me if I'm not understanding what you mean by prepackaged data. So you're asking in the collection phase, if you use prepackaged data, and I think you mean data you didn't collect yourself, won't that also be prone to bias? Amy, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Alice. And I think, Amit hinted at this as well, that it's very rare, whether you collect the data yourself or not, that you're going to find a perfect data set, right? There's always the possibility for it to include embedded biases. And part of the importance of kind of going through this in a stepwise manner and doing your exploratory data analysis and paying attention to whether or not those protected attributes are in there are part of what can help you understand your data set and whether or not it is representative of the context that you're working in, which biases might be most significant in that data set, and whether you actually have enough data to appropriately test for bias or potentially mitigate it. So I think, regardless of where your data comes from, it's really important to go through this process of checking to see what might be embedded. Even if it's something that you collected yourself, there may be hidden patterns that weren't obvious to start with. And that's why I think, again, we're emphasizing the importance of making sure that you have lots of people kind of looking at this and paying attention to different things. We all have our own biases. We're all expecting to see different things in there. And the more that you can kind of open that up and be deliberate about looking for where there may be potential bias, the more likely we are to recognize it before it's automatically embedded. Amit, anything else you would add to that?
No, I think you did a great job covering that.
Great, thank you. Alice, let us know if you have any follow-up on this. So a question that was somewhat explored on the last slide, but let's just make sure that we talk about this notion of implementation and maintenance a bit more, because this is this can be quite difficult to go back to and self-correct. So a question for both of you, and I'll start with Amit. What are some of the practical steps, and I would also add processes, tools that you've seen work in the real world that you would take to monitor for fairness as you go along? If you can discuss audit methodology in a bit more depth. How do you, for example, self-correct when things go wrong, especially given the challenges that we have around time, cost, even access to additional technical resources to self-correct? Amit, if we can start with you, and then Amy, also hear from you too.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think to start with, when we start deploying models, you don't want to go from just having something that you think is going to work and scaling it up immediately. So you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to a slow phased rollout of this model where you're testing it. You're testing to see how organizations are responding. You're testing to see what your model is doing. And then also you can check it against results that you're seeing. So if you give loans to a certain number of people, you can see, are they likely to default or not? Are we getting the same default rates for men and women that we've provided loans to? And if that's not the case, then there's probably something wrong with either the algorithm or the way it's being implemented by the organization. And so you're going to want to make sure that the model is doing what you think it's supposed to be doing by taking data that you're collecting now from the real world and using that to validate your initial assumptions about the model. You also want to make sure that as you scale this, you continue to do this. You should have a process where this is a continuous process. You also want to check to make sure that new data that you're collecting, because you're going to be constantly collecting data as you're giving out more loans, for example, is similar to the data that you've already had in your training set. So if you start seeing discrepancies between the data that the model was trained with and real world data, then you're going to have to start adjusting that. And you might retrain your model. You might start using some of the newer data that you've collected, and maybe that will alleviate some of these issues. Or you may need to shift to a different model if you find that you really went in a way that that isn't ideal. And so this is going to be an ongoing process where you're taking information, you're reusing it to work on your models and improving your models throughout the process. You also want to make sure that you've thought through some of the more common things that could go wrong and talked about how you're going to deal with it. So if somebody doesn't get loans when they should have gotten loans, are you going to have some mechanism to then go back and say, oh, we rejected loans for these individuals, but they should have gotten loans. So now we're going to go back and offer them loans. So correct the problem that originally came up because of this model or how it was implemented, and making sure that you're able to do that and have the organizational infrastructure in place before implementing in order to make sure that you can do something like that. And then Amy, I don't know if you want to add.
No, great thoughts there. I guess the only thing I would add is that, I think there's still a lot of learning to happen in what kinds of approaches to M&E are really going to be most effective in practice in picking up unintended outcomes. I think definitely to the point of making it deliberate and having it be a continuous process and checking for this perhaps on a more frequent basis than you might otherwise have quarterly or biannual monitoring is really important, especially as these are new and you're sort of rolling out and you have, some sense of how it's working based on your training and test data, but, things change when you deploy them in practice. And so, the more that you can, make the case for careful monitoring and a learning approach and building in ways where you're not just monitoring the things that you expect to happen, but being open to the idea that they may have unintended outcomes as well. And there are different kinds of approaches that may do that, whether that's, direct feedback with the people who are experiencing these loans and understanding how they experience it, looking at, just a wider variety of outcomes, really trying to approach this with a learning lens and know that there may be unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, thank you, Amit and Amy. And there's a follow-up question that's relevant to actually this topic from Ilana. The effects of bias are seen only after the fact, measured in the real world. So wouldn't it be more effective to have in place a requirement to audit algorithms that are going to be implemented, let's say for bail, before being used? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it would absolutely be great if you're able to have an organization implement requirements to audit their algorithms going forward. It gets a little bit tricky as well because the burden for audit and correction differs based on the type of the type of question you're answering. And so, if we're saying should someone be held in jail or not, or like be released from jail, then you definitely want a very high requirement to audit that and explain why your algorithms are doing what they're doing. If you're looking at trying to do logistics to provide farming inputs in different parts of the country as you're supporting your farmers, and if you get that wrong, then maybe what you're doing is there's this time delay for people getting what they need to get. Maybe your auditing is not going to be as stringent a requirement for that because the negative implications for one of them is keeping someone in jail, and the other one is delaying crops or seeds or something like that by a week or so. So you really want to think about how to implement this. And also audit requirements vary depending on what the use case is legally as well. And not that organizations should only do things because they're legal, but they can also vary a little bit depending on the legal structure that you're living in.
Amy, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I would second that and just try to emphasize that, we also don't want to just rely on audits as the one thing to help us identify bias, right? I think a lot of these steps along the way and making it a process from the very beginning of embedding that in how we approach what data we're using, whether or not this is an appropriate decision for machine learning, how much weight we put into the predictions that come out of it, kind of being attuned to the possibility of embedding bias should be part of that. And we're thinking about ways that we can build in checks for bias and initial audits and different things along the way. But I think it really is an ongoing consideration, not just when you're building or just after it's released, but trying to embed that throughout the process, knowing that there are lots of things that we can do to make it better, and there's always the possibility that we may miss something, and it's imperative that we continue to look for that once it's in practice.
Yeah, and just to echo Alice is asking, audits should happen before, during, and after. Yes, they should. And they're not the only approach to ensuring fairness in the machine learning project. I'll ask one final question before we go to the survey, because we'd love to hear from you about other topics you'd like to hear about. This is related to just, again, another reality of the nonprofit sector, and that's around data and data sharing. So how should we think about fairness in the context of projects that require data sharing? What needs to be considered or put in place, maybe in terms of policies or processes, agreements, with regards to data sharing and fairness? Either Amit or Amy, if you'd like to comment on this.
I can start, and Amit, feel free to jump in. I think it's a great question, and it's certainly one that data sharing has lots of challenges beyond machine learning too, in terms of thinking about privacy and sensitive information, and this tension between wanting to move towards more open data so that we can have more data-driven decision making and potential harms or infringements on privacy that might come from that. So it's a really tricky space, especially considering some countries have legal frameworks, organizations will have best practices, and there's a lot of different layers to it. USAID has done some thinking on this in a guide of using data responsibly that starts to walk through some of these tensions. But I think, immediately for the context of if you end up with data that wasn't yours or from your organization and these issues of fairness, a lot of the things that we talk through in terms of understanding what was the original context in which the data was collected, who was it collected from, what was the problem that it was initially connected under, Can you assess whether or not that's appropriate for the context in which you're going to use it in? What additional sensitivities might be introduced? How closely does it match the representativeness of the population in which you're now using it? Are all things that are important to consider in whether or not that's an appropriate data set to use for your problem. Again, I think there's a whole set of considerations around representativeness and appropriateness for your problem, and another set around privacy risks and you know, ways that you might mitigate potential harm stemming from sharing sensitive information. But it's certainly a complex space in which we're all learning, and I think a lot of the considerations here in terms of how do you evaluate appropriateness, representativeness, you know, understanding whether it matches your context, looking for metadata and original data owners, and as much information as you can get about that can help you make those decisions.
And I'd like to add that we'd also, just echoing what Amy said, I think we really want to focus in on doing no harm. And there are, you know, if you have specific data that's protected or sensitive, we really want to make sure that when that data gets shared, it's either anonymized or treated in some way where we're not putting people at risk. So, you know, if you're collecting information on refugees, for example, you may want to be careful about how that data is being shared. So not all data should be publicly shared between organizations, and just making sure that you're not putting people at risk who have been part of your data collection process. So yeah, I think that would be the main thing I'd want to stress.
Yeah. And to the same point that just because it's anonymized may not mean that it's completely safe to use, right? Increasingly, there are ways in which you can connect individual points of information through aggregated data sets, and thinking through what kinds of procedures are appropriate, exploring issues like differential privacy and other kinds of protections that you can put in place are really conversations that you should have depending on the context.
Yeah, all fantastic points. Thank you so much for also exploring this topic of data sharing. Madeline, if we just go to the reminder, save the date slide, great. So thank you again for joining us for these three first webinars that we've had under the umbrella of the AI ethics workstream at NetHope. As a reminder, our next webinar, which is part 4, will be scheduled for July 16th, same time, and we'll have a conversation with ethics experts from Microsoft and IBM about designing responsible organizations. And then we'll take the concepts that you've heard about over the past 3 sessions, including this one, into a hands-on format in a virtual workshop on August 5th. Invite is coming soon. Do share with us through the survey, both obviously the feedback on this webinar, but also what other topics you'd like to hear about, where the questions that are most relevant to your work, or who else you might want to hear about. So with that, I'd like to thank Amy and Amit and their teams at USAID and MIT D-Lab for a fantastic presentation, lots of great resources as noted here in the chat window, and hand it over to Madeline to wrap up this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks to all of the attendees for coming to our session and our series for AI ethics. We really appreciate your attendance and your feedback. Please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction survey. As Layla mentioned, there's a link to that survey in the chat window right now, and a window will pop up as you close out the Zoom webinar. You'll also receive a follow-up email with a link to that survey and a link to the recording and all the links that we've shared in today's session, as well as the slide deck in a PDF format. And that is it for today. Please have a great rest of your day, and thanks again.